Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. I am Geoffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which, and this is just a little secret for you, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the middle of election season. We have this phenomenal new exhibit headed for the White House downstairs that I want you to go see if you haven't seen yet. And the nation is transfixed by a new political and media moment. Has polarization increased so much that it's impossible to achieve the kind of compromise that was taken for granted throughout American history? Have our presidential campaigns been transformed by technology? Has the Supreme Court nomination process been transformed by polarization? We need to look to history for answers to these important questions. And it's hard to think of two scholars, two historians, better equipped to cast light on some of the most important of them than the ones that I have the pleasure of talking to today. We're so lucky to have together David Greenberg and Geoffrey Cowan. Their phenomenal books were published around the same time by the same superb publisher. Norton did very well with both of them. And the books are related, but obviously completely distinctive, and there's so much in all of them that I can't wait to talk about with you. So Geoffrey Cowan is president of the Annenberg Retreat at Sunnylands and also university professor at the University of Southern California. He's a former dean of the USC Annenberg School for Communications and is the author of several books, including See No Evil, The Backstage Battle Over Sex and Violence on Television. You'll see that theme of media and politics is going to inform our discussions today. And my old friend, David Greenberg, is professor of history and of journalism at media studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He's basically one of the leading presidential historians and commentators on the presidency. We met in the old New Republic days. Basically, everyone in journalism went through the old New Republic before it tragically exploded about a year ago. And it's just such a pleasure to welcome him back and to the Constitution Center for the first time. Please welcome Geoffrey Cowan and David Greenberg. Jeff, let's start with you, and I want to get the argument of this extraordinary book, Let the People Rule, on the table. It's called Theodore Roosevelt and the Birth of the Presidential Primary. Downstairs in the headed for the White House exhibit, we note that the presidential primary arose in the progressive era, but really didn't become accepted widely until the 1970s. And you tell the fascinating story of how Theodore Roosevelt and his advisors transformed the system from one that used to be run by King Caucus, where Congress people would pick the nominee, to one where the people ruled. And you put a lot of emphasis on the role of a now forgotten gentleman called Jonathan Bourne. Tell us about Bourne and how he and Theodore Roosevelt invented the primary.
Well, Jonathan Bourne was a senator from Oregon who could not have become a senator if he hadn't sort of created almost a primary in Oregon for the Senate race that he took there. So in those days, of course, senators were picked by the state legislatures and not directly by the people, but he kind of invented a primary in Oregon to get to be the senator. And then he decides that the same thing should be true for the presidency, particularly because he hopes that Roosevelt will come back out of retirement. And so he gets the state of Oregon to adopt the presidential primary, meaning a primary where when you vote, you know who the delegates there that are going to be elected are going to support at the convention. So that became a direct presidential primary. That became the first time it was done. That was adopted in 1910. And he and a group of progressives led by Robert La Follette, a name that's widely known here, the sort of the very progressive, very outspoken senator from Wisconsin, fight to create primaries in as many states as they can. Roosevelt is not part of that group. And Bourne, as you know from the book, kind of has this sort of almost love affair with Roosevelt. But he's an unwanted suitor, so Roosevelt keeps asking him to join this movement. Roosevelt won't do it. And by the time Roosevelt decides that he actually wants to come back to win, I just want to say a word about this because David's book is so interesting. But one of the things that you talk about in your book is the need of some people for limelight. And Roosevelt is probably the quintessential limelight needer.
Absolutely.
And my argument in part is that Roosevelt didn't want to regain the presidency in 1912, having been president, and picked Taft as his successor. He didn't want to gain it so much for substantive reasons, but he needed to get back in the action, and I think, following your theme, he needed to be back in the center of the limelight, and that may tell us something about people today, too. But anyway, so...
We'll get to that later.
So Roosevelt
the history.
at first thinks that the party bosses could do that year what they'd always done in the past, and they were his friends, but they were controlled, as party bosses are, by the incumbent in the White House. And so the only road to victory that he possibly had was to join these people who he didn't really much believe in and become an advocate, and then ultimately a staunch advocate for the people ruling. He did have one problem, which is La Follette had decided earlier to run. And so those people who remember the McCarthy and Kennedy battles and so forth, some of that was going on at the same time too.
There's so much that's riveting in this book, but the numbers are so stark, and you put them out at the beginning. You say Roosevelt's moral claim to the Republican nomination rested on the fact he won 9 out of these newly created primary contests, and that in those 13 states he'd won 2/3 of the delegates and more than half of the popular vote. And then you go on to tell this riveting story of how, despite that, President Taft, the incumbent, managed to get the nomination. My next book is on Taft, so I read this with great interest, and I was so struck by the ruses or the legalistic mechanisms that he resorted to, including California. Roosevelt wins overwhelmingly, but Taft wins 1 congressional district, and because the rules that called the convention say that the nominee for each state has to be selected by the congressional district, Taft gets California. Tell us, it's a long and fascinating story, but broadly, how is it possible that Taft lost the popular vote so repeatedly and yet managed to get the nomination?
Well, I tell the California story because it also relates so much to the Constitution Center, and Jeff, something that in the future we might want to do something about.
Yes, indeed.
It turns out that the national parties are private organizations. And so the way in which our presidents are nominated are really decided by a group that can create its own rules the same way the National Football League can. And if they decide that they want to change the rules for what's a fair pass or a fair catch, they can do it. If they decide they want to say that a first down is 12 yards, they can do it. That's the way the rules work for the national conventions, and that rule has been upheld, as you know, by the Supreme Court. So the Republican National Committee had decided that that the delegates were to be picked by congressional district and a few at statewide. Now, the congressional district selection wasn't, as the 1912 convention was envisioned by the Republican Party, it would be sort of the local ward heelers that would do it by congressional district. But actually, Hiram Johnson, who was the governor of California, knew, and you know this from my book, and I don't think it's ever been told before, much stuff is not there, but Hiram Johnson, the governor of California, knew that when the state adopted a winner-take-all primary, they were violating the rules that had been established by the National Party. So when the primary takes place in California in the spring of 1912, Roosevelt wins the state of California by 76,000 votes. There is a vote, the California law requires the winner-take-all primary. Taft, in order to run in California, had said he had to say he would live by that law. But you go to the convention, and the convention's law was the two delegates from the one district that he won should go to him. And you can imagine the moral authority on both sides of this. But Roosevelt was a much better publicist, going to what David's book's about. And so he persuaded the world that those two delegates, along with many other delegates, had been stolen. So when he walks out of the convention and starts his own party, he says that it's all been done by fraud and trickery and so forth, and it's not really true. And that's an example of where really Taft was on the legalistic side, but after all, he was the judge. And Roosevelt was on the side of the people because he was the publicist.
It's remarkable what a legalistic, judicial, constitutional conception of the presidency Taft had and how different Roosevelt's stewardship theory was. I want to ask David about that in one moment. One last question for now to you, Jeff. Roosevelt does not come across as an unvarnished progressive hero here. He was it's quite disturbing what he did with African American votes. He first tried to buy over African American delegates pledged to Taft, and then he betrayed them and basically said it should be an all-white party in the South, but African-American delegates would be welcome in the North. And in the end, it didn't do him any good because Wilson won the South.
Right,
Tell us about that
yeah,
terrible
so he goes to
compromise
the
he made.
National Convention about 50 delegates short, and the public thinks that his fight at the National Convention to get those 50 delegates short, because even though he's won the primaries, most of the people are picked the old-fashioned way, which is through patronage and political power and et cetera. So he's 50 delegates short. The public thinks that his fight is really over credentials challenges, including the 2 delegates from California. And he sort of claims he has the moral claim to those. But he knows he can't win that. Because after all, when you control the delegates on the floor to start with, you're not going to give them over as the process continues. It was pure question of raw power. So he had one other path to victory, which was that there were 68 African-American delegates from the Deep South. And Roosevelt thought if he could get those men to change sides, 50 of them, he'd actually get the nomination. And so he engages in a campaign, which, as you say, is not entirely polite. Money undoubtedly exchanged hands, et cetera. Whether he knew it or not, his people were involved in it. But the campaign also had a moral theme to it, which is, you support me and I'll be better for African Americans. That was his theme. Big rally he had at the Chicago's Peking Theater, the largest black-owned venue, terrific event, 1,200 people there. This is the man who better for blacks in the South. But when he walks out, he doesn't get enough of them. He gets 8 of them. And so at the convention itself, he's votes short. He doesn't have enough votes. So he walks out of the convention. Everybody here knows this, and starts his own new progressive party. Walks across the street to Orchestra Hall, and he says, "We're going to come back here in 12 weeks. You people who are my supporters," thousands of people thundering their support for him, including these blacks from the South. He says, the ones who had gone with him, he says, "You go back to your states, you nominate people for a new convention here in 6 weeks, and if you want me to be the president of the nominee of that new progressive party, I'll do it." So these men go back, and this is who you're talking about, Geoffrey. These men go back, who turn out to be quite extraordinary people, by the way. They go back home, and they try to help to organize a new party. And all of a sudden, they're back there, including a person who Roosevelt had asked to be his give the seconding speech for his nomination for president. They go back home, and they try to be part of it, and they're told, "You can't even be part of this new party. This is going to be an all-white party." Well, they don't believe it. And my focus then changes to Mississippi, where I had been involved in the Freedom Summer in 1964, where it turns out these black men didn't accept it, including a Harvard-trained doctor, several lawyers, incredibly impressive men, and they say, "We're going to send our own delegation to this progressive convention. Roosevelt can't possibly intend it." So 2 delegations go to the progressive convention from Mississippi, I'm going to focus on now. 1 all white, 1 equal number of whites and blacks. And at the convention, this gritty group of men who refuse to take no for an answer make a very strong case, and then even though Roosevelt wants it to be an all-white party from Mississippi, the vote on the Mississippi delegation goes till 3 o'clock, the Credentials Committee decides at 3 o'clock in the morning of the day in which the Progressive Party is to open, and by a 17-16 vote with 1 disputed proxy, they decide to have the all-white delegation be seated. Many people never forgave Roosevelt for this. It's amazing to me that the story's never been told before, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who later regrets what he did for other reasons that you'll hear. But he decides, and you may know, we know it from the book, but he says that he's going to support Woodrow Wilson because he's so angry at Roosevelt for excluding all the blacks in the South. So he supports Woodrow Wilson, and many of Roosevelt's other strongest supporters consider him to be completely vile for having made this decision. It's definitely a stain on his reputation, but to give him one thing so that everybody here doesn't walk out totally hating him, he did, and this is the kind of compromiser that he was. He thought people would forgive him because for the first time in history, there were black delegates from outside the South.
It is a fascinating story. It's important to tell it, and a similarly nuanced portrait of Roosevelt emerges in David's book. David, you call Theodore Roosevelt the person who was associated with the rise of the public presidency. You quote his view of the presidency in his autobiography, where he calls the executive officer a steward of the people. It's his right
Right. Well, I mean, this book, as you know, is a history of the White House spin machine, sort of its rise, and the presidents, the aides, the George Cortelyous, all the spin doctors from Cortelyou through, David Axelrod, and also of the critics and intellectuals and writers who observe the rise of spin and try to assess its impact on democracy. And people have said to me, well, why, haven't presidents always spun and cared about their image and talked to reporters? So the answer to that is yes, and you're getting at the reason I start with Theodore Roosevelt, that he's really the first one with this new conception of the presidency, this stewardship theory, as it comes to be called, where he sort of constitutionally inverts the way the power of the presidency had been understood. Previously, he says, presidents had limited their powers to what the Constitution explicitly said they could do. He thought he could do anything except which the Constitution explicitly prohibited. He really saw this as a seat of action, and coming when he did after the Industrial Revolution, there were all these social economic needs that he felt only Washington could address and only the presidency could address. So no longer was Congress to be the driver of policy. It was now going to be the president. And to do that, he needed the public. And so that was the key. A lot of his own party, and Jeff talks about these fights within the Republican Party, a lot of his own party was beholden to the robber barons, to the old guard. He was a reformer, and to make change within the party, he had to bust through the logjam of the Republican Senate, and that meant mobilizing public opinion. So he went on speaking tours. He went out west, these long train trips. He would speak to 150 different cities and towns. That was something that previous presidents simply had not done, at least nowhere near to that extent. He hires press agents for the Panama Canal Project. He hires Joseph Buckland Bishop, a reporter, to be the press agent. This causes great consternation in Congress because why should the taxpayers be funding this guy to do propaganda for the president? Eventually, Roosevelt wins that battle. He does publicity stunts. He climbs into one of those submarines, those spherical ones with the portal door, goes down to the bottom of Long Island Sound because he wants to beef up the Navy. And he has these press conferences where he, brings in the reporters and he entertains them and he tells them really what their next day's stories should look like. So in all these ways, he creates a lot, many, maybe even most of the tools that presidents after him have for galvanizing public opinion, for taking not just his own personality and his own standing, but specific policy issues to the people in order to get reform passed. And that's why the story, I think, rightly starts with him.
It's a riveting place to begin. I want to have a sense of whether Roosevelt unleashed populist forces that were broader than he was willing to embrace. So you talk about the fact that he wasn't for unchecked initiatives that thought that only educated people should be able to vote. And then you quote the theorists of the progressive era about democracy, like Walter Lippmann, who thought that because of the complexity of modern life, the masses couldn't understand what were the pictures in their minds that came from the media, and they needed experts to filter things. And then Lippmann's antagonist, Mencken, who denounced the bureaucracy and had a kind of Bourbon aristocratic notion that only a few
Right.
of the elite were able to rule. So, essentially, was Roosevelt in favor of unchecked popular democracy, or did he think that it should be filtered through the educated?
Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt was kind of the original, raging moderate. He is trying to steer a middle course. There are these new populist forces unleashed, some, by the populist movement, by other movements before he even comes to power. So there's this pent-up demand for reform, socialism, populism. He sees that as dangerous. This is kind of going to lead us in a direction, and you alluded to, today's developments, if the people have the power, where is this going to take us, right? Then on the other side, and H.L. Mencken is a good representative of this, you have a lot of people who kind of are wondering whether democracy is a good idea at all, that this is only going to lead to power by the ignorant. And for all their differences in 1912, both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson have a view where they're believers in democracy, but they believe that democracy needs wise, informed leadership. And Roosevelt sort of sees it as his mission to get the people on his side. He's going to set the path, but he feels with the proper articulation of it, they can follow. Now, Wilson is a little more judicious. He's a political scientist by training. His theory is it's the president's job to sort of listen to public opinion, to kind of take soundings. It doesn't give a clear message, but it's the president's job to sort of figure out what these inchoate noises and soundings add up to, and then sort of read it back to the public and say, this is what I understand you to be saying, and that's how he gets public support. So Roosevelt liked to dramatize, Wilson liked to distill.
Can I throw one other thing in here? So one of the most amazing things in 1912, and this is the 1912 Roosevelt, not the 1908-9 Roosevelt, he's afraid that La Follette is going to be more popular with progressives than he is, with the people on the left, or wherever you put that, the people who believe in democracy. In California particularly, there was now the initiative referendum and recall that had just passed. Roosevelt adopts a view, and you actually have a reference to it in one of the big statements out in your lobby. He comes to the position at the Ohio Constitutional Convention right before he announces, at the place where he announces, where he says, my hat's in the ring, but it's a few days before he announces publicly in 1912. He says that if the people of a state don't like the Supreme Court's rulings that struck something down because it violated minority rights or property rights or whatever, that the people should be able to overturn the decision of the courts. And this decision of his, which is very relevant to your Constitution Center, this view of his is when people like Elihu Root, who had loved Roosevelt before, decide that he's just gone too far over.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. To tell you the truth, it's a sort of odd legend for the Constitution Center to have in its lobby. I wasn't around when it was chosen, but it's basically saying that the people can overturn Supreme Court decisions by popular vote. This was anathema to William Howard Taft, who viewed it as the greatest threat to the Constitution in a generation and staked his presidential campaign in opposing this plebiscitary notion. And I think it has not fared all that well in constitutional history. What we're talking here, though, is the establishment of these populist forces unleashed in the progressive era and then developed through media. And David, I mean, there's so much to talk about in this great book, and I want you all to get both of them because you both tell the stories of each president. You talk about how Wilson, as you described, felt he should speak to Congress. He appeared in person for the first time since Jefferson, but didn't want to go directly to the people because he thought it should be filtered. And then you talk about the PR geniuses and representatives and spinmeisters associated with each of them. But this is so relevant to today. I was struck in your discussion of radio by the idealistic vision of John Dewey, who in this 1934 lecture, he said, the radio is the most powerful instrument of social education the world has ever seen, an unprecedented means for the exchange of knowledge and ideas. What was the point where the media, the radio and maybe broadcast television and the magazines stopped being seen as a method for the dissemination of facts and for public education and more for manipulation and spin?
Yeah, well, this is a debate that happens with every new technology, with every new development. So even a strong presidency, right, with Roosevelt and Wilson. There are those who see this as important leadership, and this is going to strengthen democracy. And there are those who see it as kind of putting a lid on popular forces and suppressing or limiting democracy. So radio is also seen in this double-edged way. I would say the two views kind of exist together. So there are some, like John Dewey, who really sees the great democratic potential of radio. But at the same time, you have the rise of demagogues, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, who are using the radio to sort of stir up these popular passions. And even more so, when Americans look overseas at what's going on in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's an interesting fact I stumbled upon. Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat is delivered within about 5 days of the appointment of Joseph Goebbels as Minister of Propaganda and Popular Enlightenment in Nazi Germany. So we see the double edge. to it. And so long as they have Roosevelt and the fireside chats, this is kind of good propaganda. This is radio. This is presidential communication that is leadership that we can support for the most part. There are those on the right who, of course, see Roosevelt as the demagogue, who see Roosevelt as manipulating public opinion with his radio addresses. So I would say this is a dilemma and a conflict that we still engage in. And with the internet today, it wasn't too long ago, people were hailing the internet as kind of the salvation for democracy. These new voices could be entering into the public debate. And then we worry about sort of hate and people being locked in their own ideological bubbles and all the downside of online communication.
Well, let's extend the question about the internet. In your last chapter about President Obama, you say that the net, as you suggest, was initially seen as a way of getting lots of participation from small donors, but later Obama complained about his inability to get out his message at all, even though he'd taken to the internet, as he just did yesterday, by posting. I was so jealous of this. He posted his views about his next Supreme Court nominee on SCOTUS blog. So I now issue a public appeal, President Obama. Next time, publish it on Constitution Daily when you're going to talk about what's going on next. But he's taking to the internet and then finding that because of the cacophony of voices, having a hard time breaking through. The question, the $64,000 question, or a lot more now, is, has the internet become so polarizing? Does it create electronic mobs and increase the filter bubble so people are immune from opposite points of view, that it could lead to demagoguery in a way that we haven't seen before and really transform the relationship between the presidential campaign and the media?
Well, I mean, I think we are certainly seeing that now. I mean, in some ways, Donald Trump is talked about as the kind of unfiltered candidate, the one who doesn't, think about what he says before he says it, who doesn't rely on the consultants to craft every remark. But in another respect, with social media, especially with Twitter, he was kind of light years in front of the other candidates. And where other candidates would put on Twitter, these sort of carefully constructed remarks that could have come out of any press release, Trump is out there firing away, and this has really excited the press corps because they feel they're kind of directly engaged with him. So even as they don't mean to abet him, they give him all the oxygen. And so in many ways, he's been very canny at exploiting social media beyond even what Obama had ever thought to do. These questions of whether the dangers outweigh the potential are always hard for us to say, and I think it's often tied to our personal or political evaluation of who's doing well with it. If you like Obama in 2008, you thought the internet and social media and the Yes We Can video was a great thing, and you're likely to sort of be appalled by what's going on with Trump. If your views are more Trumpian, you might see it the other way around. So, in some ways, it's dependent as much on one's political affiliations, I think, as the medium itself.
And I want to ask you a question about that, Jeff, and let you carry it from there. Just descriptively, Trump is going around the party elite in a way that would not have been possible even at the time of Roosevelt. There were further changes to the primary system in the 1970s, and you modestly are responsible for some of them. You note the statement by... Sorry?
Sorry.
Well, that's yours,
book.
exactly.
Right.
Well, you could tell the story, but I'll do it so you don't have to tell it on yourself. You quote Howard K. Smith at the 1968 Democratic Convention after Humphrey, who's not won a single primary, captures the nomination, and you say that Smith, in a bit of inflated rhetoric, said, "Over that hall tonight you'll see hanging huge pictures of the men who made the Democratic Party what it is, but one is oddly missing, that of young Geoffrey Cowan, the man who did more to change Democratic conventions than anyone since Andrew Jackson first started them." High praise. What did he have in mind? What did you do in 1968 to merit that?
And there's at least one person in the hall who was part of this too, so I'm not going to take blame alone. But anyway, what happened was, many people here will remember that in 1968, there was very heated primary campaigns in which Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy were both very engaged, and the two of them won most of the primaries. Hubert Humphrey comes along. He didn't win a single primary. And at the National Convention, it's clear that Humphrey is going to be nominated by a party where, of course, the war was dividing the country at that point, and I had been part of the McCarthy campaign. But the McCarthy and Kennedy people thought both, Kennedy had been assassinated by this point, that it was completely unfair that somebody should be nominated who hadn't even gone through this process or won anything in the process. So I played a role in putting together a commission headed by a man named Harold Hughes, who was at that time the governor of Iowa, later the senator from Iowa, which had a lot of other, Julian Bond was part of that commission and some other very interesting people. And that commission issued a report and brought it to the convention and said that for future conventions, every delegate should have to be picked through a system that was open to full public participation in the calendar year of the election. And had that been true, we were confident that Humphrey could not have been nominated. That became the system. By the way, it was changed in 1984 so that now we have so-called superdelegates, people who are the sort of party elites who will represent a certain percentage of the party. But that's why we did it. And interestingly today, that the Republican Party followed suit. God knows why, but for a lot of reasons, because these decisions that were made at the state levels, the states all reformed what they did, the Republicans went along with it. And the review of my book in the Washington Post started, to quote another person saying something about me, but about this election, it says, if Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee against the opposition of all the leaders of the Republican Party, he should send a thank you note to Geoffrey Cowan.
Yeah. Should he? Should he?
Well, maybe he should, but I'm not sure I want it. But still, but I think it's an interesting question, an interesting moment in all of these ways. And what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Just one more bit. It's a serious question.
It is a serious question.
If say it's all your fault, or you get the
Okay.
credit.
Well, there's one other person
are
who
you,
I'm also
you know,
responsible.
would you do it again? Or the more serious question is, has it become too democratic? Is there
my serious answer is I think it's a good thing, and I think there are ways in which the presidential process the primary process could be improved. But I think that the primaries make it possible, for one thing, for people who would never be thought to be electable to become electable. As I say in the book, I don't think there's any chance Jack Kennedy could have been nominated if he hadn't won in West Virginia, Catholic winning a heavily Protestant state. Reagan wouldn't have won if he couldn't have shown how vigorous he was. He was then was thought to be old on the eve of his 70th birthday. Now we have different view of elderly. And I think there's no question Barack Obama couldn't have been nominated. Had he not won actually in the white state of Iowa in the caucuses. So I think, but going to whether it ought to be overwhelmingly what it is. Imagine the alternative, Jeffrey. You know, there's a statement we all know from Winston Churchill where he says democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I thought about that a lot lately in this connection, because the democracy is a mess. And this is a really good example of democracy being a mess. But I think then you have to, in fairness, say, what are the others? So suppose we were today living in an old convention system, but you know that would have been modified over the years too. And you know that the money that's now in politics would be having a huge impact, as actually it did in its own way. That's part of why these reforms took place. Special interests and money would be having a huge effect at those conventions. And you might ask yourself, well, what would those conventions be like? Who would they be producing? Who would those people be beholden to? So in the end, I do think it's better to have a democracy.
David, is there some intermediate system that would combine primaries with some role for the party elite?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't given that much thought to, the technical reforms that one might have, but I do think the caucuses in particular probably ought to go. That starting in the progressive era, we had, the secret ballot. I mean, that comes in, we've only had the secret ballot since the late 19th century, the Australian ballot, as it was called. This is all in this wonderful exhibit, too, by the way, downstairs. The history of voting is represented there. The caucuses really, encourage the most activist elements as opposed to kind of the workaday citizens who need to just take off 15 minutes from work, at some point. So I think there are some reforms that one could make. I think the superdelegates, which were instituted in 1984 after the new primary system had given us George McGovern and Jimmy Carter, was probably a good thing. Now there's fear, well, what if the superdelegates overturn, the will of the general voters? And, one probably wouldn't want to see that. But I think there is a role for the experienced politicians, if we don't think of them as the bosses, but if we think about them as the people who know the system, who know politics, having their guiding hand on it without it being an oppressive or dominating hand, I think really is the key. And that is sort of in keeping with what I was saying earlier, the vision of democracy of both TR and Wilson, not just mass plebiscitary democracy where anything goes if that's what the people in a fit of inspiration want, but also not elitism, not aristocracy, where something that generally honors the public's voice, but where it's guided and tutored and educated.
I want to ask you this, Jeff. What so strikes me about both of your books is that in the election of 1912, so relevant to today, all sides are taking the intelligence of the public seriously. They're giving long, substantive speeches. So Teddy Roosevelt, and I bet a colleague he bet me that I wouldn't have the nerve to do this imitation, but here goes. There's this record that you can find online where he's testifying before Congress, and he's accused of giving the Abyssinian treatment to Mr. Archibald of Standard Oil when he's attacking the oil trust. And he said, "I did give Mr. Archibald the Abyssinian treatment. I will do it again and again." His squeaky voice and all that. Was that not bad? Okay, thank you. It was nothing. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So, and then Taft is reading these speeches about the Antitrust Act that are drier than anything that you'd find in any constitutional law class, labor and capital, capital and labor. And then there'd be these competing gramophone battles where you'd have the Taft records and the Roosevelt records, and they would play against each other, and then you'd hear Tarara Bumdier, and people are sitting there for 4 hours listening to these speeches on antitrust law. So this is a question, I guess, for David. Has technology so shortened our attention spans that we can't actually expect the public to absorb these complicated factual evidence that people used to do back then?
Well, I think that is probably true to an extent. It's also the case that we have set up things like the presidential debates so we don't even try. I mean, the notion that they get 1-minute answers or 2-minute answers seems to me to be sort of underestimating the public. I think people would, especially now that instead of 17 candidates, there are 5 in tonight's Republican debate. Why not have more sustained answers? Why not have direct questioning by the candidates of each other? I think there are ways. I mean, I was actually struck, even in some of the early debates, to see some very substantive policy differences. Everybody was lamenting how vapid these debates were, but one could see significant differences on immigration, on foreign policy, on civil liberties emerge among the candidates. And it's true, it's not what you described between Taft and Roosevelt, but there is substance being argued about. One of the key questions in the Republican race is the Republican electorate as sort of dogmatically conservative in the way the National Review, for example, has envisioned conservatism since William F. Buckley as we assumed. And it may be that there's elements of Trump's populism that have always been much more integral to the Republican vision than a lot of Republican journalists have assumed.
Jeff, I cut you off before. I want you to respond to this. Talk about 1912, and in addition to everything else, I want to know what you think TR would have made of Donald Trump.
Well, let me say what I think Donald Trump should think of TR, which is he could find in TR more of a kindred spirit than people in the room might imagine. And in this campaign, TR's language became totally inflammatory. People are furious with him. He's completely unfair. By the way, he's constantly changing his position on things, as you know, in a most demagogic kind of way. Publications like The Nation and The New York Times, from all across the board, think he's become completely unhinged. The private correspondence, some of which I quote, people think there's no real explanation for him behaving like he did. And people are afraid what he could do as president. So including this very extreme idea that we were talking about earlier of saying that the people should be able to overturn Supreme Court decisions. If you think about what that would mean for minority rights, that's a big deal. And Roosevelt didn't understand it. He didn't understand it, which is shocking. So he articulated this position, but he couldn't articulate it in private and serious conversations. I think one thing about this year that we should think about in terms of the media is not only the internet and all these other new media things. The biggest change in the last couple of years, or one of the biggest changes, has been the role of debates, which we didn't have until fairly recently, partly because of, as you know, the Federal Communications Act was interpreted as making it possible, basically. But we now have these debates. The debates, if you think of 24 million people, and then maybe at a minimum 12 or 13 million people, watching these debates, sustained period of time, sometimes 2 hours long, the people are genuinely engaged in this. I think you could possibly be critical of the press and the way they've run those debates, but I think the debates offer, and there's a lot of debate about debates and how they should be run, but if you think of something the media could do which could engage people, and this is where David started to talk about, I would love to see the press drill into some of these questions in much more depth, because the fascinating thing about Trump to me is, I mean, people here have their own opinions about Trump, and he said certain things that obviously have been very inflammatory and unpleasant. But Trump also, and this is where you start to get to, is defying Republican orthodoxy on issue after issue after issue. And who are these people who seem to be selecting a president who don't agree with Republican orthodoxy? That is a serious question. And that is the kind of fight, even though I think most of us aren't fully absorbing it, that you were having between Taft and Roosevelt in 1912. A fight between the orthodoxy of the stalwarts and the progressivism that Roosevelt represented.
Fascinating, and you really do so much to show the extremism, as you just said, the demagogic quality of Roosevelt as well as his progressive ones. As usual, phenomenally excellent questions from the audience, and I'm delighted to get to them. Here's a four-parter, which is just superb. I think it's to you, David. What's the difference? One, what's the difference between a populist and a demagogue? Second, does the modern social media landscape favor populists? Third, which president or candidate after Teddy Roosevelt used spin, tech, and populism most effectively? Four, where's the line between spin and populism versus propaganda? All great questions. I can repeat them if you need them, but the first one is difference between a populist and a demagogue, and then does the modern media landscape favor populism?
Well, I mean, I refer to the book. I mean, it's a long answer, and it is in some ways, you know, touches on a lot of important themes within my book. Populism really, you know, as people know, comes out of the populist movement, the farmers' revolt of the 1890s. And even earlier is associated, even though the word wasn't used, with Andrew Jackson. The movement of those outside the power centers, whether it be financial power centers of New York or political power of Washington, and the dispossessed sort of demanding their share. So you certainly see that in Trump or in any number of other candidacies over the years. Demagoguery is a style that often trades on populist sentiment, and you know where the line goes from sort of legitimate populist rhetoric and argument into demagoguery can often be hard to discern. I mean, Bill Clinton, 1992, putting people first campaign, that was a real populist campaign, but nobody would say it was demagogic, right? And yet, with Trump, with certain other figures we've seen, in our recent past, as well as, as I mentioned earlier, people like Huey Long, we feel that there's an evasion of the responsibility of the statesman. I mean, Roosevelt, although he had his demagogic moments, really was a believer in statesmanship. And that is sort of the quality most lacking in Donald Trump, for example, and I think what opens him to the charge of demagoguery. There has to be a moment where, as much as you promise to empower the dispossessed people, you also start talking like a president and seem presidential. So that is sort of where I would draw the line. As to which other presidents applied this particularly well, I think it's been there in most of them, particularly in our modern era, and in some ways since the post-68 era, not only because of the reforms where we have primaries electing our presidents, but in generally since the 60s, the style of the aloof, regal candidate who is there to sort of be appreciated by the public has given way, whether it's Jimmy Carter with his cardigan sweaters, or Bill Clinton with his bus tours, or Reagan on horseback. Sort of so much of our imagery ever since the 60s has been about making our candidates accessible, like us, erasing any traces of elitism. Even experience, as Hillary Clinton is finding, can be a dirty word. So we've had sort of this inversion, I think, really since the 60s.
Great. Jeff, two questions to you. Should the primary process be reconsidered with today's real-time social media, and why do the caucuses still survive today?
Well, on both of them, I agree with David. I have problems with caucuses, serious problems. You mentioned some of them, but one that I want to elaborate on that you mentioned briefly, it's not a secret ballot.
Right.
And I think I believe in secret ballots. So many people here probably been to caucuses, maybe working in caucuses, maybe voting in caucuses, but your boss can know how you vote. Your teacher can know how you vote, your parent or your spouse. It's not a secret ballot. I believe in a secret ballot. It's the opposite of that, so I don't like that. Secondly, the second problem that you mentioned too was you've got to have an evening free to do it. If you're a firefighter, if you're a police officer, if you're a nurse, if you're a parent with a kid or a sick kid, you can't participate. So it's very selective in who can participate. So I personally don't like the caucus system for those reasons. There are advantages to it too. I like the small state system, however, because it means that a candidate can engage in retail politicking. The biggest, and learn in the process of retail politicking, not just get to people, but learn from people. I think that there are a number of reforms I'd like to see to the current system, but I think the most important reform that I would believe in is that I think that every state should allow I think they should allow open primaries. Some states, many states, have closed primaries. You can't, and 40% of the American public are not affiliated. Well, those people can't participate in the process. And one reason I like the idea of an open primary is that I think it has more of a moderating force on the campaign. If you have a closed primary, you're going to go to the so-called base all the time. If you have more of an open primary, you can appeal more to more of a centrist view.
May I?
Please do, and let me ask you at the same time, how would an open primary system get adopted? One of our guests asks, should we have open primaries? How would it happen given the incentive of incumbents to protect the current system?
Yeah, well, I actually prefer the closed system because I really believe in parties. I think if you compare the American experience to Europe over the 20th century, the two political parties, and people may have their favorites, one they like more than the other, but have been a tremendously positive, stabilizing force as well as an instrument of reform. And that the breakdown and weakening of the parties, I think, has been, on the whole, not good for democracy. I like that new voices are brought in, but I think it's good to have the parties stabilized. And I would say to those 40%, join a party, and then have your vote that way. So how would you get to an open? I mean, because the parties essentially set these rules, the parties have to see it as in their interest to bring in the independents. Many of them already have and have moved to this open system, but it is a hard sell. I don't know, Jeff may have further thoughts.
Well, I think it's a terrific political science debate, and I mean about a real subject, which is, I actually agree with you that the parties have a major function. I don't personally, I think that the primaries have taken us so far from that I don't think the open versus closed primaries is the way to do that. That's my own view. And I think that the open primaries mean that more people can participate. The way you could do it, Jeffrey, is what we were saying before. The National Party could say at the convention this year that for future conventions, no delegate can participate who hasn't been picked through a state process which allows for an open primary. They could do that. They're not about to, but they could.
Would they have any incentive to do that? It would undermine their own power.
The incentive would come from people who felt that they would do better in the future if it was an open primary, an open process. That's part of what's in dispute right now. I mean, one of the things I don't know that Trump would do worse in an open system, but Kasich would do better. So, it sort of depends who the winner is. The fact is the party rules are always written, is so often the truth, by the winners. And so Mitt Romney wrote rules, or Mitt Romney's people wrote rules in 2012 that they thought for 2016 would favor what they wanted. But of course, it hasn't turned out that way.
I would say that in New Hampshire, it was noted how Clinton lost big in every group, except among registered Democrats, where she basically tied with Sanders, that he won on the strength of independents. And that's something to think about. Again, depending on which candidate you prefer, it is independents to a large degree who are driving the Democratic Party, at least to the extent that it's going to Sanders, in that direction.
Two excellent questions about how parties' roles have changed. One guest asks, since primary turnout is small and the extremes of the parties tend to turn out more than centrists, has this contributed heavily to the polarization of politics and changed the role of the parties? Well, let's start with that, David. And if so, what do you do about it?
Yeah, I mean, the polarization is something that I think nobody quite knows how to change. It seems to be kind of this organic process. I think it is to a large degree media-driven, although there have also been some studies suggesting that the notion that on our social media feeds we see only like-minded views is significantly overstated, that we all have at least some friends or journalists we follow who are feeding us contrary information or viewpoints. So there is some degree of engagement. There are also political problems. I mean, gerrymandering, other kind of structural forces that are kind of accentuating the polarization in Washington. And then when the public kind of feels this obligation to sort of choose sides, I think it's mimicked by a polarization at the popular level. In other words, I think it is possible that it is elite polarization that has driven popular polarization and not the other way around.
Interesting. And Jeff, what about the turnout question in particular? In the exhibit downstairs, I was fascinated to learn that in 1840 there was something like 70 or 80% turnout, but of course much smaller suffrage. Right. What was the turnout like in 1912? And is it possible to have both high turnout and an expanded suffrage?
Yeah, I think it really is, and I personally believe that the law should always favor that, and obviously that's a disputed issue too, because people want the laws to favor whatever they think will be good for their team. So what some people call voter suppression laws, as I would regard them as voter suppression laws, are done largely because you think that students shouldn't vote really because they'll be Democratic or something, or you think that people with guns should be able to have their gun licenses count as to register to vote, but a student ID shouldn't. Making it fewer days that they're open. I personally think that there are so many ways in which we could go in that direction, including having everybody be registered to vote when they get a Social Security card or something. There are all kinds of ways to do that. But I think that that one thing about polarization, Geoffrey, that I think we can't forget here, this polarization is about something. It's not just about the media. It's about something out there. And the fact that you do have Bernie Sanders on the one side, and that you do have Donald Trump on the something or other side, which I would call, we have a show in Los Angeles called Right, Left, and Center. I'd say that then when Arianna Huffington became, so you couldn't quite characterize it, became right, left, and other. I think Donald Trump is kind of other. But anyway, some positions that are more or less on the left, some that are very much on the right, the nativist stuff being probably the most troubling to me. But people are upset about something that's happened. The income problems are serious ones. The job problems, the job losses. And so people are looking for a scapegoat for that, for an explanation. And I think we have every reason to be concerned about polarization, but I think we have more reason to be concerned about those things which are giving rise to polarization.
But people were concerned about the power of the trusts and about the curse of bigness in 1912 and 1916, right. But they did not express their anger in the same way. What has changed?
Well, I'm not sure they didn't express it in the same way. I mean, we had, as you know, a lot of violence. The rise of the labor unions, which were being put down rather violently in many places. One of the things that was most surprising to me in the research for this book, by the way, was that we think of Roosevelt as a trust buster. But in fact, Taft was more of a trust buster than Roosevelt.
Absolutely.
And Roosevelt's supporters in the campaign, his main supporters, came from U.S. Steel because they were so angry at Taft for prosecuting him.
Absolutely. Someone asked about fact-checking on the media. As a Brandeis partisan, I my fact-checking knee jerked when Bernie Sanders said, like Teddy Roosevelt, I want to break up the trust. No, it was Wilson who wanted to break up the trust. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to regulate them.
That's right.
And Taft wanted to prosecute them.
Can I say one quick
Sure.
thing about turnout? I mean, this goes back to the progressive era. Turnout was phenomenally high in much of the 19th century, even after the electorate expanded to a considerable degree. The main thing that changed it, there's this wonderful book by a historian named Michael McGurr called The Decline of Popular Politics. What changed it was the progressive vision that weakened the parties and that said voting should be an individual act of conscience. And so some of the reforms, including the secret ballot, which of course I support, encouraged the individual to become a master of all policy. And this was the kind of thing that Walter Lippmann said was beyond most people's, not their intellectual capacity, but people don't have the time to do this. So people became expected to sort of make up their mind individually on all these policy issues. Voting, politics became, a seminar, it became a burden. Instead of this sort of boisterous, rollicking, out-of-doors affair that it had been in the 19th century with the torchlight parades and the rallies. And that shift, where it became a kind of thinner kind of engagement, due in part to the weakening of parties and other reforms, it was sort of this unintended consequence. So most of us, I think, would endorse many of the progressive era reforms that made the process more democratic. But one consequence is it put the burden on the individual to go out there, learn everything, get out and vote. And that's just a lot to expect.
Yeah, I mean, one way you can see this is there's a lot of talk about the ground game. Well, the ground game, now we talk about does each of the candidates have a good ground game, meaning do they have a good get out the vote process? Well, the get out the vote, and those always have to be invented every election by a candidate. The get out the vote process used to be the parties. They were the word healers. They were the people who, and they knew you, and they had a relationship with you. Have you voted yet? Can we take care of your kid while you vote? That doesn't happen anymore, and that is a weakness of losing the strength of the party.
Well, first, I'm just curious, you're the decline of popular politics, a counterintuitive thesis. What does he mean by that?
Well, what he means by popular politics was this 19th century style where people were participating in high numbers. You got a ballot, again, in the exhibit downstairs, you can see what you did. You got a ballot, it had all the Democrats' name on it, you checked it off and put it in the ballot box. When it shifted to where it was you, the individual, and you would go in and, well, Republican governor, Democratic, congressman. Or, there was much more ticket splitting, the rise of independents. Now we have 40%, as you say. In the 19th century, there were relatively few independents. So there was a shift from a sort of party-centered orientation that, was about big turnout to one where it was a media game where the two parties would then compete for this middle slice of swing voters, moderate, independent, centrist voters, in a limited number of battleground states. And that sort of thinned out the attachments to politics. And this was a change that really, we think of it as recent, but it really goes back to the early part of the 20th century.
Okay, time for closing statements, gentlemen, for this fascinating conversation. Both of you describe ways that the populist forces that Theodore Roosevelt set in motion are being played out in the election of 2016. Have those populist forces gone too far, and would the founders approve? Jeff?
Well, I think the founders couldn't have imagined the situation we have today. But that's true for so many reasons. They didn't like the idea of parties to begin with. Just start with that. And then you think about the people who couldn't vote, including probably half the people or more in this room that couldn't vote at that point. So the fact is that the founders' vision is not the vision entirely that we are embracing today. I think there are ways in which this movement has maybe gone too far, but I think the way in which you feel that way is sort of how do you feel about the candidates who are running in a year? And I think one of the difficulties is that there's nobody, probably most people in this room aren't truly inspired by many of the candidates, or candidates who give a realistic chance of winning. And so I think that the question I keep asking myself that goes back to this thing is, if the system were different, would we have more inspiring candidates? And just to tell you, on the debate over primaries, probably there are a lot of people here who admired Adlai Stevenson. We did. My dad actually, relates to your book, was the radio and television campaign manager, that was the phrase, for Adlai Stevenson.
Oh, Luke Cowan.
Luke Cowan.
Yeah, he is in the book.
Nice.
I just didn't know the connection.
And he didn't, and Stevenson said, I don't want to be sold like a bar of soap. He was trying, and so that, but Stevenson didn't like primaries. He thought they were very destructive. And I can't help wondering how many people aren't running now. Who would the people you'd want to run because of the system that we have? I think that's a fundamental question. But otherwise, I think the system itself, for the people who are going to run, in the end, forces them to be vetted, forces them to develop their ideas, and in the end, I think gives us a better democracy.
Great. David, last word to you. Has the populist forces of TR gone too far, and would the founders approve?
Well, it's like someone said when asked about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell. We're in the middle of this thing, right? And who knows? You could get Hillary Clinton against Marco Rubio, and he'll be, glad we survived that. Or maybe not. I think it's hard to tell right now whether the upheaval this year is due to the particular issues, income inequality being a big one, but other issues that are really driving people this year, or whether it's about these other structural changes, media, politics, that are causing this to happen, and stuff going on within the party. So I don't think the verdict is in over whether this is really a historic turning point yet. So I'll sort of dodge with that, but I do think it is a great opportunity to sort of study and assess this question that you've been probing so well of, where in democracy should sort of popular enthusiasm, to what degree should that be recognized and honored and respected? And at what point is it important to have restraining influences, whether it's the parties, institutions like good old-fashioned objective news media, like the old networks and the New York Times, and to where is the right balance between sort of institutional stability that we can get from some parties and sort of popular desires. And it's something that America has been struggling with, that balance throughout its history.
Beautifully said. That is precisely the question that we will explore throughout this phenomenal spring leading up to the Democratic National Convention. The spring schedule will be on the web in just a few weeks, so follow it. Come early and often to the National Constitution Center. I have to ask for a show of hands. Who here is a member of the National Constitution Center? Wonderful. It's beautiful to see that. Anyone who's not, please stop by and see Rebecca Bolden in the back and sign up so you can get advance notice of these spectacular programs. And go buy the book downstairs. Please join me in thanking Geoff Cowan and David Greenberg.
Yeah, he's in there. Probably all stories you've heard before, but